All right. Hi, and welcome everybody to this episode of Determinate Content. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by Mark Kovacs, who is Senior Lecturer of Philosophy at Tel Aviv University, and his interests span metaphysics, epistemology, and applied ethics. And today, we're going to be talking about grounding and his kind of view of what's going on there. So, the question I ask to everyone before we start is, how do you get into philosophy, and why do you think it's a worthwhile pursuit?
Yeah, so hi, and thanks for having me. So it's interesting that you mentioned applied ethics, because it's not really a research that I'm currently pursuing now, but it was actually what got me into philosophy originally. My father also happens to be a philosopher. He's an applied ethicist. The first philosophical work I've read was a textbook in applied ethics, which he wrote when I was 12. At the time, I only read it because it was written by my father, so I was interested. But I was actually immediately hooked up and very quickly became passionately interested in these topics and approaching these seemingly burning questions with the kind of thinking that philosophers usually bring to the table. And after that, I immediately began to read the philosophy, and I read quite a bit of it as a teenager, and knew from pretty early on that this is what I would like to be doing for a living. So it was pretty straightforward.
And why do you think it's worthwhile, if that question can be answered separately?
Right. Why is it worthwhile? Well, so I guess my answer to that is going to be a bit of a platitude. I think that in the end of the day, everybody engages with philosophical questions. It's just not really possible to avoid them. We are making difficult moral choices all the time. We are arguing about politics. We are arguing about maybe metaphysics less so, but burning questions in applied epistemology. Which news source to believe? Whether to listen to this or that expert. When is it justified to override expert judgment, and so on and so on. And these all raise very difficult philosophical issues. So why should we be interested in? Well, we unavoidably do it anyways. The choice is between doing it in an informed and reflective way, as opposed to just doing it unreflectively and naively. We might as well do it right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for that. It was really good. Yeah. Your paper, An Explanatory Idealist Theory of Grounding, concerns grounding, which has been a really big hot topic in analytic philosophy and metaphysics the past 15, 20 years. So I think for our listeners, it would be nice to just start with the very basics. So what is grounding? What is it supposed to be? And what is metaphysical explanation? So we can start with grounding, and we can go to metaphysical explanation.
If you don't mind, I would like to start with metaphysical explanation, because that makes it easier. That makes it easier for me to explain grounding. So metaphysical explanation, and I think this independently of my own view, by the way. So okay. Metaphysical explanation is supposed to be a sort of analog of scientific explanation. Although not necessarily all, but most scientific explanation connects phenomena that unfold over time. Typically, but again, not always, there's some sort of causal connection between them, or often a statistical connection. Metaphysical explanation is supposed to be explanation that tracks a more intimate, constitutive sort of connection. Okay, so it's supposed to connect phenomena or truths or facts which are related in this in virtue of way. It asks why does this fact hold? Why is it, for example, that this action was wrong? And the force of why is that we are not inquiring about the past circumstances that brought it about that stealing is wrong. It doesn't even look like that. That's the sort of question such that we can inquire about that. Rather, we are inquiring about what makes it the case, in virtue of what is it the case that stealing is, that this act of stealing is wrong. So this is the force of metaphysical explanatory questions, or why questions that inquire about metaphysical explanations. Now, what is grounding? So I think the literature is confusing in this way, because there's a pretty large group of people who just use it basically as a synonym for metaphysical explanation. It's just, for them, it's just a fancy word for that. Mike Raven calls them unionists. But there's another group of people who think that grounding is to metaphysical explanation what causation is to scientific explanation. So if causation is this glue that relates phenomena over time, then grounding is very roughly its synchronic analog. It's a sort of relation, or a little bit more carefully, connection in the word, a synchronic rather than diachronic cement that connects phenomena in this very intimate way and supposedly underlies metaphysical explanation. This is controversial, but personally, I think that the debate between these two understandings of grounding is largely verbal. It's just people using the word in these two ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So I guess, as you said there, like on a common view, or on one possible view, so the grounding relation is what kind of backs or undergirds metaphysical explanations, in the same way that the causal relation would kind of undergird scientific explanations. But as you hinted to at before, you want to start with metaphysical explanation. So in your view, grounding is in some sense to be explained by metaphysical explanation rather than the other way around. Would that be a good characterization, do you think?
Yeah, that's pretty close to the view I'm trying to defend. Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of led you to take this view, do you think?
Yeah. So I'm going to take this question literally, because I mentioned a few considerations in support of the view in the paper, but not all of them were equally important in actually moving me toward this picture. So I think it might be more helpful if I give you the core intuition that led me to start suspecting this view may be correct. So focus on things that people in this literature say about grounding on the one hand and metaphysical explanation on the other hand. And of course, I mean people here who don't use these words as just words for the exact same concept. So people who distinguish between these two concepts nonetheless use very similar talking points to introduce them. Actually, even when you look at people who distinguish between them, they tend to say very similar things about grounding and metaphysical explanation. They tend to say that, well, these are explanatory relations in some sense, and somehow they have this explanatory force. They tend to ascribe to them certain formal features, typically irreflexivity, asymmetry, and transitivity. Not everyone accepts these formal features, but it's extremely rare. I can't even really think of anyone. I might be proven wrong, but I can't really think of anyone who denies some of these formal features just for one of these relations, but not for the others. So there's this harmony between the formal relations of grounding and those of metaphysical explanation. Both are usually thought to be hyperintentional, which means more finely grained than modal concepts. Both of them are usually thought to be synchronic. When you're asked to give textbook examples of grounding, you're going to give the same examples as when you give textbook cases of metaphysical explanation. So there's this extremely tight connection, which is a bit surprising, because when you look at other supposedly explanatory relations, the connection usually isn't quite this tight. So I know this as an aside that I actually also find the analog of the view that I'm developing in this paper, causal idealism, fairly plausible. But I think the case for causal idealism is somewhat weaker, because you can find some of these analogies. Causation unfolds over time. Causal explanation isn't something that unfolds over time. In the case of grounding and metaphysical explanation, neither unfolds in time. Causal explanation is usually thought to be transitive, but the transitivity of causation is heavily debated. So in the case of grounding, there's this exceptionally tight, beautiful lining up of almost everything that people say about one of these notions appears to carry over to the other. And I think that's somewhat suspicious. Why is that? Why does the word so conveniently serve up a relation that behaves exactly the same way as metaphysical explanation? I think that we should find this somewhat odd and surprising. And one possible explanation of this beautiful alignment between grounding and metaphysical explanation is that the concept of grounding that we use is already tailor-made for metaphysical explanation. It's a concept that was cooked up to answer exactly this explanatory need. And if it's downstream, or as it were conceptually parasitic on metaphysical explanation, then it will be completely unsurprising that it behaves in this way. So this is the core intuition that led me to start finding the view attractive. It's not the alpha and omega of the case for it, but I think this is the intuition that got me suspicious.
Yeah, and just to see if I have the view right. So on the unionist view that you mentioned, grounding just is metaphysical explanation, but that's not your view. The concept of grounding is tied to metaphysical explanation. What it picks out is dependent on metaphysical explanation, but it's not as if grounding itself is that. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's good that you mentioned the unionist view, because it is closer to the unionist view than ordinary separatism. I forgot to mention, but that's Mike Raven's coinage for the main rival of the unionist view. So it's a kind of separatist view, but it's much closer to the unionist thinking, because there is almost no difference between grounding and metaphysical explanation. Or as you wrote it previously, it's something like the shadow of metaphysical explanation.
Okay. Yeah. So I suppose, to tie back to what you said earlier about grounding having an intimate connection with metaphysical explanation, one reason that I guess people have wanted to sort of hold them separate is that grounding is supposed to be a very objective thing, supposed to be a sort of as you mentioned, like a cement or a glue that holds reality together, whereas metaphysical explanation is sort of dependent on our interests and the context of evaluation of explanations and so on. Do you have? I suppose your account could accommodate that distinction, but do you see any kind of worry there about making grounding too much of an interest relative notion if you tie it to explanation in this way?
Good question. So I would prefer to be neutral about this. I definitely don't want to be committed to grounding being an interest relative notion. I also wouldn't want to rule it out. So the way I guess that what there's a complicated question about exactly which notion of objectivity you're interested in. So I think it's relatively easy to avoid the view that somehow grounding is in the eye of the beholder. You can get, for example, a weak notion of, the way in which grounding is downstream from metaphysical explanation could be a conventional matter, for example. In that case, social convention would just settle, along with certain empirical facts. It could just settle which sentences about metaphysical explanation are true, and that would settle which propositions about grounding are true. This is not the sort of heavy-duty realist view that grounding force are usually looking for. But it also doesn't force us to say that grounding is in the eye of the beholder. If we disagree about a question of grounding, one of us is going to be right and the other one is going to be wrong. This may occur for just this very superficial reason, that one of us complies with the conventions guiding the use of the word grounding and the other one doesn't, but there's still an objective fact of the matter.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that the convention and empirical facts would decide which grounding sentences are true. And so, on your view, there would be a bunch of these abundant properties that we could pick out, and some of them have these formal features that you talk about, reflexivity, transitivity, and so on. And others might drop one of them. And when we talk about grounding, or our grounding sentences pick out one of these properties, and depending on our practice of explanation. And this might differ in different communities and so on. But it seems there, as you say, if you have this sort of view, our conventions would somehow determine what property we pick out, and thus they would play a big role in making our grounding sentences true, although they would not take part in making they're not part of the grounding property itself, so they're not making the propositions true in some sense, but they're determining what proposition a sentence expresses. Is that a good way to put it?
That's a right way to put it. Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
So I see there is this general, so when it comes to views that purport to be deflationary or conventionalist in roughly the way that I want this view that I call grounding idealism to be conventionalist, there is always this one danger is slipping into this much more hardcore kind of conventionalism, and the facts themselves are somehow a mind-dependent matter. And the other thread that you want to avoid is slipping into triviality, because as you just noted, there's a completely trivial sense in which the truth value of sentences is a conventional matter, because of course social conventions, we get to decide what our words mean, and that's not a very, in and by itself, that's not a very interesting sense of conventionality. So one thing I would like to add is one thing I would like to, so grounding people don't usually explicitly say how the meanings of ground theoretic vocabulary get to be determined. It's not usually explicit. But here's a natural way to think about it. One way to think about it is that these relations in questions are sparse. There isn't this abundant plenitude of ground-like relations. There's just one or maybe two. If there's this abundance of relation, there's just one relation, at least in an other sense of relation. And that relation is highly intrinsically eligible to serve as the referent of grounding. That's a possible view. I haven't really seen it defended in print, but it would be, it just would be a very natural way to push back against the kind of view that I'm outlining. So I think that the sort of conventionality at issue is easier to understand if we add this negative point that there's this plenitude of ground-like relations. And there isn't any deep metaphysical difference between them. There isn't some joint in nature that heavily privileges the one of these over all the others. And that is not that kind of conventionality is not entirely trivial. You know, a lot of people think that when we use natural kinds terms, for example, that's not how reference determination works. Joints in nature do at least some of the work, either via reference magnetism or just by, according to a milder view, are very intentioned to pick out something natural in the world.
So, like, yeah, on your view, the grounding relation isn't intrinsically something that we it doesn't have this intrinsic pull that makes us talk about that thing. We could have talked about something else quite easily. I suppose to just, it might be good to give a case where you think this pull exists. I mean, you mentioned natural kinds before, but I mean, I suppose one view of a common view about like water, for example, there are many different descriptions that linguistics communities have had over time about what water is, but they've always picked out the natural kind, H2O. On your view, that's not the case for grounding. It's not as if we had all these different theories about grounding, that different formal aspects, and one of them is like the unique correct kind grounding that all of them are talking about being either right or wrong. Is that a good way, do you think, of spelling out the difference?
That's a good way to spell out the difference. I'd like to add two small things. So it may be that everyone is talking about the same relation of grounding, but I'm actually somewhat suspect this is not the case. But if it's the case, it's just because there's a dominant convention, and even people who diverge from the convention, they're not, perhaps due to very externalist facts about reference determination, they nonetheless use the word with the same public meaning, and they are just wrong. They are just wrong about the word's extension. So that's perfectly possible, but I don't think it requires. I don't think it requires anything like a mechanism of reference magnetism, for example. I do want to add, though, a small point, because in another paper, I defend a view just of metaphysical explanation, irrespective of grounding. That's basically a unificationist view, and the details of the view are not so important there. But according to that view, at least on the version that I developed, one relevant factor in metaphysical explanation is that the explanans facts tend to be quite natural, not necessarily perfectly natural, not even necessarily quite natural, but the basic idea is that metaphysical explanation is a matter of unifying the phenomena according to certain criteria. And one of those criteria is that in our total set of explanations, the exponentia ought to be as natural as possible, other things being equal. So in that very indirect way, I do actually believe that naturalness has a role in grounding, because the collective naturalness of the putative exponentia taken together does play some role in what metaphysically explains what. And in this paper, of course, I argue that what grounds what is downstream from what explains from what. So naturalness does play a role, even on my view, but it's a much less direct, weaker role than according to this picture that I think implicitly a lot of people assume, and which I criticize.
Yeah, and I suppose even though the exponentia have are natural or have some degree of naturalness, the relationship between them, I like the grounding relation, doesn't itself have to be natural just because of that sort
Right,
of joint
right.
harmony. Yeah,
That's quite right. Yes.
yeah, okay. So you mentioned before that there could actually be kind of genuine disagreement on this view, that if the convention facts determine that we speak about one property, we could disagree and someone could be right and the other person could be wrong. But what if there's like in the future there'll be like two camps or three or four camps about grounding, and they'll all they all think that they have completely different like formal properties and so on. You would just think of them as talking past each other, or I mean, I guess that depends, but roughly speaking.
So yes, it depends. So I'm not exactly sure what to say about the verbalness of disputes about grounding. I don't think there's a general diagnosis that applies to all debates about grounding. I think some specific debates about grounding, I highly suspect that some highly specific debates about grounding are verbal. So my favorite example is this small subliterature on the transitivity of grounding. It's very hard for me to see how that could not be a verbal debate, because it's just so easy to construe it as one camp meaning the transitive closure of grounding, and another camp having in mind something like the relation that Fine calls immediate grounding. And in general, when there's a debate about the transitivity of a certain relation whose transitive closure we can coherently conceive of, it's just very tempting to construe that debate as verbal. I have the same view about debates over the transitivity of partude, which is pretty minor because almost like most mereologies, like especially of course classical extension of mereology, assume that partude is transitive, but that too strikes me as verbal. Now, I'd like to add a very important proviso for that. Matti Ekland asked in a different context a few years ago about ontological debates. So Eli Hirsch, of course, famously holds this view that many ontological debates about material objects are verbal. So Matti Ekland asks, is this a necessary fact about ontological debates that they are verbal, or it just accidentally so happens? And he makes the very good point that it's incredibly hard to believe that this is a necessary fact about ontological debates, even if you discover that two philosophers talk past each other when they argue about ontology. Is there nothing they can do to fix this misunderstanding? Is there nothing they can do to get out of this verbalness? That's just very difficult to believe. So I'm very sympathetic to this point of Matti. And I think something similar about grounding, that even if some debates about grounding are verbal, this is easy to fix if the participants reject the claim that their debate is verbal. If once they are presented with the semantic hypothesis that it's plausible that their debate was verbal, and they still think the debate is not verbal, then I think that beyond this charity to truth principle of charity to truth that on which Hirsch bases his diagnosis of verbalness, we also owe them what in another paper Matthew McGrath calls charity to expression, which means that it's a part of charitable interpretation of speakers to allow them to express their views. Yeah. And if it's part of their views that they are genuinely disagreeing about the world and not just how to use certain words, then we should also take that self-diagnosis seriously. So bottom line, I think some specific debates about grounding are probably verbal, but I only think this about debates. I only think this about debates where I suspect that even the participants might agree on reflection. But if they don't, I'm going to take it back. It's definitely not a predicament that is necessarily their situation.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so going back to where we started discussing the view. I mean, your view is that grounding is downstreams from metaphysical explanation. I mean, is one way to think about that disagreement, if there is one, is that would that be that the two parties are disagreeing about how to give explanations of the metaphysical sort? So that, I mean, if, for example, one party agrees that grounding is transitive and the other says that it's not, what is actually going on is that maybe they have different conventions of explanation, and one requires that you go all the way, you follow the logical steps through in the transitive chain, and the other doesn't. Or would your view have any implications for how to construe disagreement relative to metaphysical explanation, do you think?
So this would be one possible diagnosis. So let me maybe say this. That would be a very natural source of the disagreement. It's also, of course, possible. One piece of evidence that I cite in favor of the view is the surprising alignment between explanation and grounding. But of course, there's hardly anything in logical space that somebody has not said about grounding, and it's perfectly conceivable that someone would push back on this point and say that no, metaphysical explanation is transitive, but perhaps grounding isn't. So in that case, it's of course very difficult to diagnose the disagreement as just disagreement stemming from different conceptions of metaphysical explanation. In that case, it's going to be something else. I would still say that at least one party in the debate is talking about grounding in a non-standard way, but it will be awkward or difficult to just diagnose that it's stemming from disagreement about grounding. I'm not sure there's really a one-size-fits-all diagnosis of the debates that my view serves up here.
Yeah, that's an interesting view, but I mean, the view that metaphysical explanation has certain formal properties that grounding does not. And I mean, I guess wouldn't be, if you have this view of reference fixation, wouldn't that be outlawed, at least if I'm talking about our own conventions about metaphysical explanation? Because if they diverged, so would also the extension of the word because, or
I agree. So I think that the view itself, my view would imply that the view itself would be substantively false. But I couldn't give the diagnosis that the debate stems from different conceptions of metaphysical explanation. The view, in fact, would have to be false as a matter of substance. I mentioned this as an aside. Why would anyone take this? Why would anyone take this view? You might be tempted, for example, by this analogy with structural equation models in the causal explanation literature. So there are philosophers of causation who think that causation isn't transitive. At least some of them would probably accept that causal explanation is nonetheless transitive, but causal chains aren't always connectable in this way. So if you're tempted by this analogy, then you might say something similar about grounding. I don't think, I don't have anything other than a sociological argument for this claim, but I don't think this is a common view. I don't think this is how people usually think about grounding. But it's hard to say it's an incoherent view.
It's an interesting view. You can definitely say that. I mean, at the end of the paper, you talk about, you say that it can still be useful to kind of differentiate explanation and grounding. And I'm not sure if I understood the example, but maybe we could go through it here. So your example concerns like metaphysical laws. So on one account of explanation, in order to have a successful explanation, you need to mention the metaphysical law. But on a view of grounding, you don't have to put the metaphysical law into the grounding relation. The ground can fully well do its work without having the metaphysical law as a to its help. And so there could be a difference between them. Yeah, could you say a little bit more about that and how that's kind of possible to square on your account?
Yeah. So the different ways in which the exact mechanism by which grounding is downstream from metaphysical explanation could be understood. So one way you could think about it is that metaphysical explanation is something like grounding plus laws of metaphysics. You could reconcile this view with, so just because you hold this view, you can still accept that grounding is downstream from metaphysical explanation. In that case, the law of metaphysics would just be something like the remainder. What remains of metaphysical exponentia once you extracted what you accept as grounds. So why might grounding still be heuristically helpful, even if it's something that's completely downstream from metaphysical explanation? Well, because at least for some philosophical debates, this gnomic component. One reason that grounding might be heuristically useful, even if it works in the way that I suggest in the paper, is that if you think that there's more to metaphysical explanation than grounding, for example, some metaphysical exponentia are laws, metaphysical laws, then at least for some philosophical debates, these laws of metaphysics don't seem to be particularly important. So the example that I give, for example, in the philosophy of mind is, at least on one way of understanding debates over the body-mind problem or physicalism is what are exactly the grounds of facts about phenomenal experience, for example. So you can ask that question, or if you like the distinction between grounds and the metaphysical laws, then in order to get the complete explanation, you also need to cite metaphysical laws. So it would be what grounds the fact that Jane is in pain. You're going to specify, for example, some underlying neurophysiological facts. But if you want to keep the distinction between grounds and metaphysical explanation, you're also going to cite laws, some laws of metaphysics. For example, it is a law that if a subject CFAB is firing, then the subject is in pain, for example. And the basic idea is, when it comes to arguments about, this is just an example, but when it comes to arguments in the philosophy of mind, construed in ground theoretic terms, this gnomic stuff or this metaphysical gnomic stuff doesn't seem to be what's important. So maybe I can just give one example. Do mental facts metaphysically supervene on physical facts? It's at least one. If they supervene, then once you fix the physical facts, as a matter of necessity, you ought to get the mental facts. But the question arises, what is it that you are fixing? How much can you fix? How much can you, by way of exponentia, you can assume in order to ask the question, well, do these things taken together fix the mental facts? It seems clear that you can't, it wouldn't be useful to include metaphysical laws, right? If metaphysical laws have the form all F's are G's, and you assume such a law, and you also assume that an instance, an instance of the F's, like, X is F, then of course it's going to logically follow that X is G. That's not going to be very useful if you want to know whether there is this at least metaphysical entailment relation between mental facts and physical facts. So even if you are a dualist, and you don't think that grounds necessitate what they ground, many people don't, and you think that there is this metaphysical law connecting physical states to mental ones, but it's a contingent law. That's also a possible view. You're still going to get that the law, along with the grounding fact, necessitates. The law, along with the physical fact, necessitates the mental fact. But that's not, that's not really what you wanted to know. You wanted to know something just about the grounds. So this is just an example of why grounding might be a useful heuristic. If you want to use it, for example, to formulate rival positions in the philosophy of mind, it might be more useful than metaphysical explanation in that context. But that doesn't mean that it's not a concept that is just downstream from metaphysical explanation. It could be something like metaphysical explanation minus metaphysical laws. That's one possible conception of grounding. But you're going to be more interested in this minus thing than in the entire set of exponentia.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. So there could be a divergence between, like, I don't know if this is a formal feature, but at least it's a feature of the logical construction of an explanation and the logical construction of the grounding claims about grounding. But you can still say that they're connected in that you can always, like, there is a connection between them, although it's not a full harmony, I guess, as you stated before.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, there can't be full harmony, because if there's full harmony, then by Leibniz's law, they would need to be identical. So the harmony can't be full. It's just this surprising alignment. I admit it's a bit of an elusive expression. But this is the basic idea. You might think that when you look at metaphysical explanations, there's an interesting subset of exponentia, and that interesting proper subset deserves to be called the grounds of the target exponendum phenomenon. You might have that view, but if you're a grounding idealist like me, then you're going to think that this interestingness is primarily a pragmatic phenomenon. It's useful for understanding and formulating certain debates, but that's only as deep as it goes.
Yeah. I was kind of interested in the relationship between this view and sort of quasi-realism and kind of expressivism and ethics, because I guess another problem is this, there seems to be like a curious alignment between what my interests are, what my moral motivations are, and the moral views I hold, or the moral facts I claim to pertain. So from my point of view, there's this surprising alignment between what the moral facts are and what I'm motivated to do in the moral domain. And I guess the quasi-realist view is that there are moral facts. We talk about the world, but we talk about these abundant moral properties, and that are, as you said before, in some sense like a shadow of our predication. And do you see any kind of similarities between your view and kind of like that expressivist, quasi-realist type of account, and that has become very prominent in ethics and also other areas?
Great.
Yeah. That's
So
perhaps a big question,
to,
but
so I have to admit that the answer is now that you mention, I do, but I haven't. But I haven't. It wasn't really on my mind when I was writing the paper. The analogy with quasi-realism is really interesting. I will admit that my grasp on quasi-realism, at least as it was originally formulated by Blackburn, isn't completely firm. I definitely see the similarity. I remember seeing this deflationary kind of view formulated in terms of abundant properties, abundant ethical properties, at least in one place. I think maybe in I don't want to say something wrong. Maybe in a book by Scanlon, and the debate between him and Justin Clark Doane. So that view is definitely, and of course, Matti Eklund has been writing extensively about this possibility of abundance of normative properties, mostly as a problem for a certain form of moral realism. So I definitely see the similarity. I'm not sure I have anything very insightful to say about the normative case, but yeah, it's a good point, and it's something I would like to think more about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of similar in that it is not as. It seems that what they're trying to not say is that like moral facts are conventional, or they are like
right,
in some sense like dependent on moral sentiments, and that would seem to be quite similar to your account, because you're saying like grounding, it's not as if that's like the property itself is dependent on explanation. It exists independently of what it is we do, but the fact that we talk about it is in this significant and non-trivial sense dependent on explanation.
Right.
So I guess, and that's a kind of an intriguing view. I mean, you discuss it in the article about like other similar views that have been proposed. So, for example, Ted Sider on modality, which is, if I've understood it correctly, the view that there is a bunch of different necessitation properties that one could pick out, and we happen to land upon one, but it's not, there's nothing about that property of necessitation that is inherently special, and that this is supposed to be like an alternative to sort of conventionalism that says that necessitation is like dependent on us. So, which seems a bit impossible, because if our conventions do not exist, then nothing necessitates anything. And similarly here, if we didn't have a convention of explaining things metaphysically, then grounding wouldn't exist. So I guess that's a similar kind of position in the logical space.
I agree with that.
Yeah, but you wouldn't say that like from this view that grounding is, I mean, what is the kind of because there seems to be some dependence, although it's not this kind of straightforward one. There's some dependence of grounding upon metaphysical explanation.
I mean, I'm not sure it has to be that way. So one way that you could think of it is, and I admit I don't have terribly well-formed views about this, what exactly the semantic values of predicates are. I just call them abundant properties, but you might think of abundant properties as these Freudian concepts, which are abundant, but they are out there for us to grasp and they would also be out there for us to grasp if we had never existed. I mean, well, we couldn't then grasp them, but they would be out there. And the way we talk about metaphysical explanation just determines which of these concepts out there we grasp. So I don't think you really need to say that the concepts themselves are in any way dependent on human cognition or explanatory behavior.
Yeah, but I suppose that perhaps ties a little bit back to our previous discussion about like disagreement and so on, because I suppose a realist might want to claim that not only are these things independent of us, but diverging. Like you can have extremely divergent views about the same thing without talking past each other. And whereas this, on your view, I mean, unless there is, well, I guess you could say that two different conventions nevertheless talk about the same property, but it wouldn't be for any kind of, the reason wouldn't be that this property itself is like metaphysically significant or anything like that.
Right. The reason would be, so if that's what happens, I mean, again, this is something I'm a little bit dodgy about, because I don't have a very strong view of exactly what we should say about the first order debates. They might be verbal, some of them might be verbal. I definitely don't think that we are stuck in this predicament that they are verbal. That would be, you know, as Martin notes, that would be like magic. How could you have a verbal debate that you just can't get out of? That would be really weird. But one plausible scenario is that there's a pretty robust convention to talk about, to mean one particular thing by grounding. A minority diverges from that convention, but the convention itself serves as an externalist fact about reference determination. So even this minority group inadvertently and unintentionally uses the word grounding for the thing for which everyone else uses them. This is a possible way that debates could be unfolding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then exactly. Yeah. So then, but as you say, it's still like a deflationary realist position, because the realist might want something more than that. Although it's
at least I imagine so. I imagine so. I mean, I imagine so, because again, one of the difficult things about framing the debate is that at least historically, I mean, or historically in the sense of past 20 years, ground theoretic metaphysics has usually been seen as a rival to natural properties and intrinsically eligible semantic values and that kind of stuff. Usually these have been construed as somehow apt to feel similar theoretical roles. These are useful theoretical gizmos to breathe life into old metaphysical debates. I'm speaking very crudely, obviously. So for that reason, for this sociological reason, there's very little that grounding theorists usually have said, have had to say about natural properties or reference magnetism or lack thereof. So the debate is not usually framed in this way. I find it convenient to frame it in this way.
Yeah. Another connection which might be interesting to go down is this. There's this position called like Melianism, which is the notion that like the concept natural property is itself not a natural property, it's an abundant property, And although, I mean, you mentioned now that these two like camps, grounding and naturalness, are like often held separately. I mean, there's still a connection, as you were talking about before, in that the explanantia are usually held to be quite natural. And I mean, I suppose there are a bunch of other connections as well, given that, as you say, they have like roughly the same theoretical roles to play. And would you say that, I mean, this position here would be that grounding is not, is itself abundant? Would that commit you to anything like this Millian view that like naturalness itself is also an abundant property? Or what do you think are the connections there? If you have any views.
So it's good that it's nice that you asked about it, because I'm actually also sympathetic to this Millian view about naturalness.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's what I wanted to know.
You might have guessed. I'm also sympathetic to that. So as I earlier mentioned, I do, after all, see an indirect connection between grounding and naturalness, because I think that grounding is downstream from metaphysical explanation, and metaphysical explanation is a matter of theoretical unification according to certain criteria, very roughly: strength, simplicity, and the naturalness of the facts that figure in the explanans base. So I'm in this other paper, I'm talking about natural facts rather than just natural properties. And there, at that point, you might also be a Millian about naturalness, and then you get this completely deflationary view all the way down. This is one of the places where I throw up my hands and say that, well, I like the view, but you can accept the rest of it even if you get off the boat at that stage.
Yeah, that's true. But I suppose they are similar in that, I mean, there's something kind of, it's definitely not an inconsistent view, I think, but there's something kind of wonky about thinking like there is this unique characterization, this like unique structure to reality. There's a definite way of carving it up, but the way to carve it up is not itself, or the unique way to carve it up it's itself not part of this structure. It's not like mandated by nature itself that we use this specific notion of structure. And similarly here, you would say like there is this like cake layering structure to reality in terms of grounding, but there's nothing about nature which forces us to think about it being in those terms. And that's a kind of like a very interesting view at the very least. I don't think it's inconsistent, or do you have anything to say about that?
I don't think it's inconsistent. I think there's so maybe I can add a further thought. You bump into these. So when you're pondering the notion of naturalness, for example, at issue, you very quickly bump into these ineffability worries that Matti Ekland raises in his book when he talks, for example, about ardent, this intuition that he calls ardent realism. So you might think, there is a natural structure to the world, and this is just an example. There is this natural structure to the world, and the grounding order follows that. But of course, the structure that it follows is natural, and it isn't schnatural. And an alien philosophical community could get by just as well with the schnatural order that they are imposing on reality. But at this point, one very deflationary thing that you can say, and this is something I'm quite sympathetic to, but of course, naturalness is superior to schnaturalness. Why? Well, it's just the way the concept works.
Mm.
It's true that naturalness is superior. The alien community is going to say, yeah, but naturalness is superior. By their own criteria, it serves their cognitive goals better than naturalness. But at that point, again, if you're just this hard-headed, deflationary theorist, at that point you can just say, okay, but so what? I just wanted to know if grounding is superior to shrouding, and it is. And this is where my story ends. You can't dig deeper than that. When you try digging deeper than that, you're hitting this wall of ineffability. And it's not clear that anything useful can be said at that point.
Right.
Because of course, Matti doesn't stop at this point, but you can be, you can be this intentionally hard-headed deflationist and just say at this point, well, that's I'm losing my grip on what more is being asked. Everything you can say about this, you're either going to say in English or some technical language that you cooked up. You can't really step out of you can't really step out of the circle of concepts that you can cook up to talk about this stuff. I don't think you can really find a way to make this vision rationally compelling for an alien community and realize the error of their ways, or at least this is I think the intuition that drives this this ineffability diagnosis, that once you get to naturalness, if you try to explain why naturalness is better than naturalness star or naturalness, you just hit this wall of ineffability. You can't really say it. Whatever you're going to say is going to sound trivially compelling to people in your own cognitive community and uncompelling to a community that just uses different standards.
Yeah. And you have roughly the same view about grounding here, as about superiority. Then, like, if you talk to some group of people who you have different kind of formal properties attached to grounding, you say, well, good for you. But I want to know about grounding.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I'm quite driven to that way of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we should start to wrap up soon. But I had one thought about abundant properties. So, like, one way to characterize abundant properties that I've come across is that abundant properties do not form part in any kind of explanation whatsoever. They're just kind of like, they're not projectable. They're not part of giving a complete account of the world. But however, with grounding, it seems that, I mean, I think you mentioned at some point in the article that, like, grounding, claims about grounding can themselves ground further things. So, like, P grounds Q can itself ground P grounds Q or R, which is just any proposition or something like that. And thus that, I mean, in some sense, they would be explanatory, although maybe not in an interesting way, but they would be explanatory. And then, I mean, I guess one could ask then, how could grounding be an abundant property if it plays a role in explaining things like that?
I think that it's mainstream ground theories themselves who are committed to the claim that all abundant facts explain all sorts of things.
Oh, that's true.
Because they have these principles of impure logic of grounding. Facts ground disjunctions in which they are disjuncts, and facts jointly ground conjunctive facts whose conjuncts they are. But those principles are supposed to be true without exception. You can take any arbitrary gerrymandered fact or fact, which is the instantiation of any arbitrary gerrymandered property, and it's still going to grant something, disjunction of itself and something else, or an existential generalization that it witnesses. So I actually think that if you are this fine inspired running theorist who likes these principles, then you need to accept that facts, no matter how abundant and gerrymandered they are, will always explain something else. Admittedly, not everybody accepts these principles of impure logic of grounding. I myself don't accept them. Because it's very hard to see how you can get these kinds of explanations if you adopt the kind of unificationist view that I defended elsewhere. Michaela McSweeney has a paper where she also argues against these logical principles. So they're not entirely uncontroversial, but at least it's a to Coke kind of argument. At least it's a kind of ad hominem. I think mainstream ground theorists are in the least good position to complain about that feature of the view.
That's true. That's very interesting. All right. Well, I think we should start to wrap up now. But I want to thank you so much for joining this episode of Determinate Content to talk about your explanatory idealist theory of grounding, and it was very rewarding. And I thank you for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.